Hi, everyone, and also to those of you who are here with us online. I'm Melanie McAllister. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies, and it is my honor to introduce our speakers today. Our visitor from Haverford is Zainab Saleh, who is an associate professor of anthropology at Haverford. She's interested in questions of empire and colonialism, belonging and subjectivity, migration and diaspora, and violence in knowledge production. This keeps her busy. She wrote her first book, Return to Ruin, Iraqi Narratives of Exile and Nostalgia, which was published in 2021, as an inquiry into the transformation of the Iraqi political landscape, both in Iraq and in the diaspora, and the reconfiguration of understandings of selfhood among Iraqis in London in light of the US-led intervention in the country in 2003. This book was winner of the Evelyn Shakir Nonfiction Award of the Arab American Book Awards. Her most recent work, which is officially published next week, is titled Political Undesirables, Citizenship, Denaturalization, and Reclamation in Iraq. You can get it online now. The book considers the legal making and unmaking of citizenship in Iraq, focusing on the mass denaturalization and deportation of Iraqi Jews in 1950-51 and Iraqis of Iranian origin in the early 1980s. Using archival documents, ethnographic research, and literary and autobiographical works, Dr. Saleh shows how citizenship laws can serve as a mechanism to discipline the population. Citizenship in Iraq has functioned as a privilege closely linked to loyalty to the state rather than as a right enjoyed unconditionally. With the rise of nativism, right-wing nationalism, and authoritarianism all over the world, this book offers a timely examination of how citizenship can become a tool to silence opposition and produce precarity through denaturalization. She's also published in numerous scholarly journals and presented her work very broadly. I won't try to list all of that, but we are very fortunate to have her with us today. I'm very excited you're here. And her interlocutor will be our own Attiya Ahmad, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology and International Affairs at GW. She's the author of the fantastic Everyday Conversions, Islam, Domestic Work, and South Asian Migrant Women in Kuwait. This was the winner of the Fatima Mernissi Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association. Dr. Ahmed has also received the Henry Luce ACLS Fellowship in Religion, Journalism, and International Affairs in 2017, and was a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center at Stanford in 2014 through 15, among several other awards. She also did us the kindness of serving as interim director of the Institute for Middle East Studies a few years ago. Her current interest in research include work on halal tourism, which I can't wait for, and historical textiles. So please join me in thanking both of them for being here with us.
I'm going to stand up for this presentation, and I'll try to time myself. So thank you everyone for coming here, and thank you so much, Attiya, for inviting me, and Melanie for this wonderful introduction. And also I would love to thank the Institute for Middle Eastern Studies for inviting me for my first official event about the second book. So thank you so much. So this book, I will try to really time myself because I can talk about it a lot. It's a very personal book for me, and it's a book that really has been informed by growing up in Iraq under Saddam Hussein's regime and having our neighbors disappear suddenly in 1980 because suddenly they were designated as Iraqis of Iranian origin. But that kind of experience of mass expulsion was always situated into other references about denaturalizations in Iraq by my parents. So it was kind of a personal pursuit trying to understand the Iraqi citizenship laws and how citizenship can really become so politicized. And this project was supposed to be actually my PhD dissertation. I was supposed to go to Iran to do field work with Iraqi refugees who were expelled, but I couldn't get the visa and everything fell apart and I changed my topic, ended up going to the UK, but here we go. I came back to it. So how do I move this?
You can use the arrow keys on the keyboard for that.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So this book is really about the practice of denaturalization that is really very widespread worldwide, but it's very much understudied, because when people always talk about citizenship, it's in terms of naturalized people and how naturalized people citizenship is always precarious in case they made a mistake on the form or something. But this book is really tries to think about the denaturalizations of citizens, of native-born citizens, by people in power. And in the Middle East, the whole issue of denaturalization began with the British and the French. Of course, the Ottomans did it as well, but I'm talking here about the nation states, is that people who were opposed to colonial rule were all, individuals who were opposed to colonial rules were always expelled, whether in Egypt, in Morocco, in Iraq, throughout the Middle East. So to me, that really denaturalization is part of colonial and national governmentality. And in Iraq, the case of Iraq is really interesting because you have the whole history of denaturalization of like Shia scholars who were against British rule in 1923, Iraqi Assyrians in 1933, when Assyrians tried to have some form of autonomous rule. And then Iraqi communists between 1954 and 1963 were all stripped of their citizenship. But what was really tragic about the cases of Iraqi Jews and Iraqis of Iranian citizenship is that denaturalization led to a collective punishment of whole communities. And these forms of these forms of statelessness, like, wasn't just about producing legal precarity, but it's also producing other forms of precarity and violence. So all Iraqis, like Iraqi Jews and Iraqis of Iranian origin, who were denaturalized, lost their citizenship, became stateless, lost their careers, lost their documents, had their properties confiscated, and they were displaced to places where they were seen as the other. So, for example, for Iraqi Jews, when they went to Israel, they were called actually dirty blacks, and they were seen not being Jewish enough. And they lost their way. And of course, the Iraqis of Iranian origin who went to Iran, they were called Arabs, and that's during the time of the Iran-Iraq war. So they also lived in very precarious conditions in the places they went to. But also part of the struggle people had is that they had to encounter family separation. And for example, Iraqis of Iranian origin had no contacts with family members for decades because there were no way to connect with them. And also one of the things that was really tragic that happened with later on is that sexual violence became part of the collective retribution against these citizens. So that really, when you look at the history of Iraqi citizenship, you see that citizenship is not an unconditional right, but it's really a privilege that is closely tied to the state. And what has been interesting about the history of denaturalization in Iraq is that whether it's under the monarchy or under the Republican rules, like all ruling elites reproduce the same rhetorics of foreignness, disloyalty to the state as pretext for denaturalization. So that's kind of the right to uproot. I develop it and I use the word uproot rather than like denaturalization, because denaturalization really involves all these other forms of violence. And the other thing I wanted to focus on is that, yes, citizenship as a legal category is really important in the sense that the state has the power to define who belongs and who doesn't belong. But Iraqi deportees themselves have really a lot of also power to challenge these categories by claiming belonging to Iraq through different ways, through like political activism, literary production, emotional attachment, and and memories about the past. So to me, like the right to uproot is employed by the state to cast doubt upon who is an Iraqi and who belongs while the right to reclaim, it really serves as a refusal of the state's exclusionary practices, and reflects efforts to articulate a complex and a nuanced sense of identity. So to me, like, it's really, when I try to think about citizenship and denaturalization, not to think just in terms of government, but like also how people try to challenge these categories even after displacement. And I'm not going, this year, the 2025 year marks the 75th anniversary of the expulsion of Iraqi Jews and the 45th anniversary of the displacement of Iraqis of Iranian origin. And one thing that I do in this book is like how with the rise of the nation state, how political aspirations, hybrid identities, and regional networks began to be demonized. And that's how, like, decades later, that can really result in frightening consequences. And what I thought, like, I never thought when I was writing this book, is that it's going to be so relevant, especially right now in the United States, when we see like the attack on different people, and not just like on immigrants, like how people who are vocal against the government, like you can start seeing like these people are not American, or they should be stripped of their citizenship. So that's where citizenship can become extremely dangerous when it's mobilized and weaponized as a tool to denaturalize people, especially to denaturalize political dissidents. So I'll stop here, and I can't talk about that endlessly, as I said.
Thank you for your comments and laying out the architecture of the book, Zainab. Welcome again, and thank you, and congratulations on the publication of your second book. As a person who's in the midst of trying to write a second one, I'm very envious. So just a few brief remarks, and then I've got some questions for you. So I deeply appreciate your book, and I thought I would start by sort of laying out in schematic terms what I thought was your book's major intervention, which is the right to uproot, in more general and non-specialist terms, and not in the historical nuance and detail that you provided us with. Okay, so the book, so the book is set against a historical and geopolitical backdrop of the continuing hegemony of the nation state, linked to sociopolitical organization and subjectivity. Against this backdrop, many scholars have focused on the movement of people across borders to examine the exercise and the limitation of nation building and state formation, and the emergence of sociopolitical forms and subjectivities that are related but not reducible to the nation state, such as diasporic formations. And here I would, and maybe a bit slower. And here I would include your first award-winning book, Return to Ruin, Iraqi Narratives of Exile and Nostalgia, a wonderful book that both powerfully and poignantly establishes how diasporic Iraqi subjectivities that have developed in the 20th century need to be situated in relation to broader imperial histories and ongoing colonial and neo-colonial relations. So in examining cross-border movements, including in the form of migration, refugees, diasporic formation, there's often a focus on the extension, the suspension, or the exclusion of the conferral of citizenship rights, and on the institutions, the processes, and the everyday practices that make this possible. Where to gloss, there is often an overriding focus on movement into and conferral into. So your book, Political Undesirables, and we'll take an opportunity to wave it up again to the audience, takes a different tact, right? Focusing as it does on what you refer to as the right to uproot in Iraq, the legal-based, state-driven efforts to strip groups of people of their citizenship, to denaturalize and to expel. And then you argue quite convincingly that this is a site and means through which the state establishes and reinscribes its sovereign power. So rather than focusing on the particularities of the circumstances marking the denaturalization and the expulsion of different groups of people in Iraq, and here I'm just going to reiterate, whether this be the Syrians in the early 1930s, the vast majority of Iraqi Jews in the 1950 and 1951, communists in 1954, the Taba'iyya or the Shia, often associated with Persianness or Kurdishness, so these populations from the late 1970s onwards, you argued that beginning with the British colonial presence from the early 20th century onwards, there's an overriding process at work, a compounding series of laws instituted by the emerging, then consolidating, and then reinforcing Iraqi state. Right? So they right to ruin. Okay, so a nice counterpoint, right, to your earlier work, but also to what I think is the overriding focus people often have, looking at citizenship as a site and means through which we see the formation of the nation state, its reproduction, its perpetuation, but here you argue for the right to uproot. So the first set of questions I have are connected to this major intervention and concept tool that you present us with. That it focuses on populations who are denaturalized and expelled because they are deemed by state authorities to be threatening, right? And then this is the justification that's used to denaturalize and again, expel them. Even to populations, again, as you discussed, that have been integral to Iraqi society. And I was wondering how your work and how your analysis speaks to other works that often examine these processes and emphasize either the religious or ethnic difference and to systems of governance and rule in accounting for denaturalization and expulsion.
Thank you so much, Attiya. So actually, like my work, what I found really fascinating is that whenever, especially like in the studies of the Middle East, what's fascinating when citizenship and denaturalizations are mentioned, it's more in terms of colonial powers, in terms of like how the French and the British expelled people who were opposing the mandate system. Having said that, like even in Britain and France during World War I, denaturalization of citizens was actually legal, like especially people who opposed the war, World War I. So that was kind of, but like it's always hinted at. Like that's like what I found like about studying the denaturalizations of native-born citizens. It's always kind of hinted at. It's never taken seriously because most of the scholarship and the debates, the major debates on citizenship, takes for granted that the citizenship of native-born citizens is guaranteed. So it's a right that's inalienable. While when actually you look at the historical record, and once you find a case or two here and there, then you know that in the future things can take a very scary turn. So that's kind of where I was. Like most of the studies of citizenship focus on migration and displacement and people trying to get resettled or trying to get citizenship or people losing their citizenship when there is political turmoil and how the government uses like citizenship forms to say, oh, somebody lied or did something. So I was more really interested in shedding light on what happened to native-born citizens who everybody assumed their citizenship is guaranteed. So that's kind of where I was trying to like draw attention to that this is something that citizenship, we should not take citizenship for granted because citizenship is an extremely political tool that can be weaponized by people in power during time of political upheaval. So that was what I was trying to bring home.
Thank you. And then you point to, again, not wanting us to overemphasize events, moments of expulsion, but to look at larger, the larger sort of set of compounding legal systems and what you argue is an overall structure to these processes. And I wonder if there are particularities, so not to poke holes at your argument, but maybe to help the audience who get to read your work, get a sense of maybe some of the texture, the complexities related to these different groups of Iraqis who become denaturalized or expelled. So were there differences that marked, although they were subject to the same set of legal processes that you argue are confounding and continue, are there particularities that mark their these different groups' experiences?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really a great question. So actually, one of the things I try to do in this book, and it will be interesting to see how especially Iraqis will read it, because one of the arguments I make in this book is that denaturalization has been a consistent policy under different regimes. And for Iraqis, for the great majority of Iraqis, like the monarchy was the golden time. It's like it's so romanticized as like this time of political and cultural vibrancy and like Saddam Hussein's rule or the Ba'ath regime's rule represents a rupture. So one of the things I was trying to do is really to show continuity in governmentality between different regimes. And I know like once actually one of the chapters in this book was the first article I've ever published academically. And one of the reviewers like dismissed the article saying it should not be published because Saddam Hussein is a dictator and he would have done whatever he wanted to do without recourse to law. So to him, that my analysis of the denaturalizations of Iraqis of Iranian origin in 1980 was just like, and I'm saying he because it was like typical reviewer number 2. So it was really interesting how that got dismissed. While then you have all these cases of denaturalization, like Iraq lost one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world, and that's completely erased. So like whenever Iraqis like talk about the monarchy and how great the monarchy was, and I'm like, you have all these instances of denaturalization, and then a whole community was uprooted and expelled. How does that square? So I really wanted to show a consistent pattern of governmentality that has been able to survive for 100 years almost, and was employed by both by colonial and national ruling elites. So that's one of the things I was trying to do. In terms, like, so there are like each case actually has its own historical specificity, even though the rhetoric by the state has been consistent. The rhetoric of the state is like these people are foreigners, they are disloyal to the state, and they are like agents of a foreign government. So that kind of rhetoric has been consistent by the British people under the officials in the monarchy and then under Saddam Hussein's regime. However, the historical context is very different because with each case, the government is trying to deal with a certain group or individuals that they saw as unruly. So for instance, with the Shia scholars in 1923, it was the British wanted to deport them because they were against British rule. And they actually managed, they opposed the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1920, and they issued a fatwa against participating in the election. So they really represented a challenge to the British. So the British deported them, and that was actually, that's it. That was the end of the Shia opposition to the British in this regard. And then in 1933, then you have another development, which is like the British had to deal with, which are like the case of Assyrians, because the British, just like the Kurds, the British promised Assyrians some form of autonomy. And that didn't happen. And then there were treaties that the Assyrians felt uncomfortable about, and they tried to protest. So then the Iraqi government is like, these people are foreigners and they are a threat to the states. They should be denaturalized. But they just denaturalized the leader of the Assyrian community, not the whole community. And then after that, it's the communists actually who became the problem for the Iraqi government. And even the denaturalization of Iraqi Jews to a great extent is situated in that fear of communism. So with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the situation of Iraqi Jews began to be a little bit precarious. But one of the main reasons why the Iraqi government wanted to expel Iraqi Jews, and the British actually pushed them to do that. The British were like, Iraqi Jews should be sent to Israel. Is that the Iraqi government was very much suspicious of Iraqi Jews because the younger Jews were so much part of the leftist movements and part of the Iraqi Communist Party. And in 1948, there was a big uprising in Iraq against another Anglo-Iraqi treaty that actually, and these protests led to the annulment of this treaty for a while, but that made the Iraqi government very antagonistic toward the Jews, and they hoped that communist Jews and the few Zionist Iraqi Jews and poor Jews would leave for Israel. So that's again talking about the political context and differences. And then the other case happened in 1954 and 1963 with Iraqi communists. It's again individuals. It's all the sphere of communism. And then communism began to be defined as a foreign ideology. So if somebody is a communist, then it means they are an agent for a foreign power. And that's why people should lose their citizenship. And then in 1980, with Saddam Hussein, there was another reconfiguration because of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, because of the Shia underground opposition movement in Iraq grew more powerful. Saddam Hussein decided to really mete out a collective punishment to people whose ancestor held the Persian nationality under Ottoman rule. So the majority of really Iraqis, in Iraq, we call them the so-called Iraqis of Iranian origin, because they are really majority of them are Iraqis, mainly Shia Arabs and Shia Kurds. In Iraq, we have Shia Kurds who are a minority within a minority. So they were all expelled. The whole group began to be demonized. Now what we hear about immigrants, a wide range of people get demonized. So this is so the historical moments are different, but the rhetoric has been kind of consistent, interestingly.
Okay. I have two questions.
Yeah.
Based on your comments now. So the first one is how you would situate your work in relation to other work and scholarship that focuses on the groups that were denaturalized and expelled. And I will note that you mentioned in your book that there is more scholarship on the Jewish populations, and notable works here include those of Baruch Hashem, Ella Shohat, Abby Schlein, and Sarah Kersley's recent work. And you mentioned that there is little work on other populations. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that and how you would situate your own intervention in relation to the works.
Yeah, so actually I situate especially my intervention as the opening, hopefully, for more scholarship on this topic. Because other than Iraqi Jews, most of these instances of denaturalizations are just mentioned fleetingly in scholarship, especially on Iraq. So one of the things that, and this is also in the book, I try to emphasize, again, the difference in historical experiences play a huge role. Because for Iraqi Jews, they began to go to schools, to secular schools, since 1870, when the French Alliance School began to open schools in Iraq for Iraqi Jews to get education. So Iraqi Jews historically have had more of an opportunity to have education than the rest of inhabitants of so-called Ottoman Iraq. So that when they were expelled, they really did tremendous research about in terms of writing memoir, archival research, literature talking about experiences of expulsion and arriving in Israel. While the instances of other communities, especially the mass expulsion of Iraqis of Iranian origin, the scholarship on that is extremely scant. And there needs to be so much work to be done, especially in terms of Iraqis of Iranian origin. So I really see this book as just one effort, hopefully to be followed by more interest, especially in the expulsion of Iraqis of Iranian origin, because there is barely anything that's written about them.
And then the next question I had was, is there a spatial or geographic dimension to this overriding process and system of the right to uproot? How are these populations that were denaturalized and expelled, how are they situated, in terms of the locations and geographically in the Iraqi nation state? Were they concentrated in particular regions? If not, did that make it more possible to strip them of citizenship rights if they're not concentrated in a particular region?
So it's really interesting because in the case, thinking about, I think the most group that paid a high price for their regional connections are Iraqis of Iranian origin. So the term Iraqis of Iranian origin refers to people, to Iraqis whose ancestor held the Persian citizenship or nationality under Ottoman rule in order to avoid serving in the Ottoman army and paying taxes to the Ottoman Empire or the Sultan. So there is this one aspect of it, but like also this case speaks about like regional connections along the border cities between Iraq and Iran. So people always moved back and forth for economic opportunities, but also like Iraqis and Iranians have these like centuries-long connections because of Shi'ism. So there have always been regional connections between like Qom and Najaf and Karbala and Kazimiya and Baghdad. So all of these back and forth movements kind of came to be demonized. So it's really interesting that kind of the nation state or the establishment of the modern state of Iraq really wanted rigid rules and like made these trans-regional connections not viable and actually demonized. So that's kind of one of the things in terms of Iraqis of Iranian origin. It was mainly people who like along the border areas, but people also who had connections between holy cities in Iran and Iraq. So the majority of the people were lost from there. In case of like Iraqi Jews, like it was definitely felt much more in Baghdad because at that time in the 50s, like Baghdad was really tiny and 1/3 of the population were Iraqi Jews. So that, but like also there was a massive expulsion from the south because of feudalism. So a lot of people like farmers who could not make ends meet came to Baghdad. So Baghdad was expanding a lot. But that kind of in terms of geographically, like holy cities, Baghdad, that was where really the concentration of people who were expelled was felt the most. And kind of there was nobody who, like it was like, especially like, for example, in 1980, it was impossible not to know somebody who got expelled. And I would assume also in 1950, given that Iraqi Jews like were 1/3 of Baghdad, that's like a huge, and then when the majority of Iraqi Jews left in 1950, around 5,000 remained until the early 70s. That kind of the geographical distribution becomes very like clear here.
Okay, so twinned with the right to uproot is the right to reclaim. That there are other imaginaries, other practices, other socialities, histories, solidarities, and you discuss how these sort of examinations, reclamations in relation to the past are connected to some of these populations' hoped for futures. So I invite you to discuss this concept more, and then how your analysis in this book, framed as it is in terms of the right to reclaim, how this work pushes or contrasts or complements your discussion of Iraqi diasporic formations that constitute your first major book.
Thank you. So to me, like one thing that always struck me about Iraqis, so sometimes Iraqis make fun of me. I'm a self-hating Iraqi and I'm not really Iraqi enough because my grandparents were Lebanese. So there is always like casting doubt about my Iraqiness and I understand why. But what fascinated me about like Iraqis is like their attachment to Iraq. I left Iraq in 1997. I haven't been back. I don't have a desire to go back. And I know Iraqis get very mad. It's just because like I have really a lot of bitter memories. So I don't want to go and confront that reality. So it always fascinated me why Iraqis I've met, whether in London or in the United States or Lebanon, like have this like tremendous nostalgia for Iraq. And this like so I was trying to understand that. So, and this is like really what when it comes to it is like memories of growing up, childhood memories, like memories about friendship, about food, about a huge family connection. So that's what like it's the social relations that they are missing, and that's what they hope they can kind of see a little bit when they visit Iraq. But also the other thing that when we think about Iraqis, like I'm an Iraqi, like why my my attitude about returning to Iraq or visiting Iraq is so different from the majority of Iraqis. So for a good segment of Iraqis, they really lived at a time when they thought a utopian future and egalitarian future is possible. And they lived at a time when political activism was against colonial rule and the feudalism was really very strong, and they were integral to that part. So, for example, for Iraqi Jews, like when they talk about the 30s and the 40s and like the cultural renaissance, the political activism, and how they were just part of it, and how that life experience really like made them think of the possibility of a utopian future. And that's why like there is this huge nostalgia for Iraq, because to them they inhabited an Iraq where an alternative future was possible. While I lived under Iraq under Saddam Hussein's regime, and the only thing I heard is like, this is not the Iraq we like from my parents. This is not the Iraq we grew up in. This is not a true Iraq. This is just a place ruled by a thug. So again, there was always like for us Iraqis who grew up under Saddam Hussein, the older generation always dismissed our experience as not being true. You just knew Iraq under authoritarianism. You didn't know Iraq like under the monarchy during the golden age. So that's to me like these experiences, like and how they get expressed in emotional attachment, in nostalgic memories, and about the life people live is so important and represents a counterbalance to like the right to uproot. Like yes, the Iraqi government uprooted all these people, expelled them, but it could not like prevent them from claiming an Iraqi identity or Iraqi subjectivity or to assert belonging to Iraq. So that to me, like I didn't want to just pick up citizenship as the parameter or the prerogative, like just limited to the state. Like I wanted to show how Iraqis themselves construct a notion of Iraqiness, what it means for them to be an Iraqi. And also in terms of like the case of Iraqis of Iranian origin, like this is the historical difference, is that most of like everybody who is like Iraqi of Iranian origin is mainly Shia. There were a few cases of Iraqi Assyrians getting expelled under the pretext of being of Iranian origin, but it was like just a limited number of individuals. But also with Iraqis of Iranian origin, like especially the generations that came from Iraq or moved from Iran or moved from border areas, like they began to have economic mobility, but they had to like only engage in trade and commerce because of discrimination, like because the Iraqi state was mainly run by Sunni statesmen. And then when the younger generation began to be able to have class mobility and were sent abroad to study and went to universities in Iraq, the expulsion happened. And so that was immediately like, that ended. So, and that's one of the reasons why they haven't been able to like produce any scholarship. So the historical experience, and yet the nostalgia for Iraq is like about this aspect, this prospect of social mobility, economic opportunities, having a different future was still felt by many of them. And the nostalgia actually, this like I see these two books as being continuous, because the first book to me is about the U.S. intervention in Iraq and how the U.S. intervention led to people like massive displacement because people had to flee Iraq. And it was always like the thing that, as I said, like always amazes me is the nostalgia Iraqis have for Iraq. I'm like, if you lived in a place that's so scary, why are you nostalgic to go back there? What's wrong with you? So that's what I've been trying. And it is again like the whole, like the social relations, the hope people had. Like that's really like when people talked, like in the first book, when people talked about Iraq, is like there was hope for an alternative future, and they just can't let go of that. Like they are kind of stuck in that. How could Iraq be so prosperous? And there was a huge like vibrant political and literary movement. How could all of that like end in wars and authoritarianism? So that's kind of the lived reality versus the imagined past has like produced such nostalgia and attachment to Iraq that is definitely noticeable. And actually, like also with the first book, because the first book, when I couldn't go to Iran and I decided to go to Britain, it was in London for the first time ever in my life. I met Iraqi Jews because when I lived in Iraq, like there were around 40 Iraqi Jews left, and I've never come across them. So that and so kind of when I was doing fieldwork for the first book, I began having like these two projects, and I didn't know how they will go. But they went the way they did. So, like, whether like Iraqis who were expelled or Iraqis who fled Iraq because of authoritarianism, like the majority of Iraqis who are not young, that had always like asserted emotional attachment to Iraq and asserted being Iraqi. And they kept that through speaking Arabic, through food, like the most amazing Iraqi food I have is usually with Iraqis in London. So that's like how the attachment kind of remained.
So in addition to nostalgia and hope, another term that is a recurring trope and almost a leitmotif in your work is that of haunting. And so, for example, you discuss this in relation to your childhood neighbors and what happens to them. You tell this in terms of the story of Kismet.
Yeah.
You also discuss the issue of haunting in relation to Iraqis in London who are remembering and remain hopeful that disappeared brothers might be found one day. So haunting permeates the book. And I wondered, in thinking about the concept and the term of haunting, how you conceptualized it through the book, if you were in explicit or implicit conversation with other works that examine this, the issue of haunting.
Yeah. So actually, the issue of haunting is interesting for me at two levels. So the first level, it's like the whole issue of haunting and ghost is about like repressed violence from the past. Like that's where like the haunting comes. It's referring to things that have been repressed. So I'll come back to that. But the other thing for me about haunting, and that was like one of the tragic thing about doing field work, or like difficult things, not tragic, difficult things doing field work with Iraqis, is the division among Iraqis. So like Iraqis all love Iraq, and they all are very nostalgic. And yet, after 2003, they are all fighting among each other across like sectarian lines, across class sensibilities. Actually, class is extremely important in Iraq, across political differences. So, but like also what I noticed when I did field work in London with Iraqis over almost 20 years now, like there was this idea of like each group you talk to. So if you talk to Iraqi communists or Islamists or Christian minorities, like everybody has this idea that we suffered the most and our suffering was unprecedented. And what other Iraqis lived through is not as bad as ours. So actually, like one day I would love to write an article about hierarchies of suffering, because for Iraqis in London, like the more you suffer, the more you are Iraqi. So unfortunately, this hierarchical thinking about suffering have led to divisions and us seeing these all instances of expulsion and displacement as being disconnected. So every group, the majority of each group talks about themselves as like we were targeted by the government and nobody has sacrificed as much as we've done. So with the idea of haunting is really tries to kind of shed light on this shared experience, on this like repressed violence that people are unable to see how connected it has been. And that's why like Avery Gordon's work was really essential to me in developing the idea of haunting, that haunting is not something about a pre-modern thinking or sensibility, but it is actually a very modernist sensibility like that indicates or signals to repressed violence. So to me, like part of the haunting is not just like about the experience of people themselves, or like in the novel of Kismet, that there is truly a ghost of somebody, but it is also about all these instances of violence and dispossession that kind of all Iraqis are struggling with and living through, but they are unable to see how they are connected together. And actually, they are employing them to divide. To create more tension and division among themselves rather than trying to look. This is what I said at the beginning. It will be interesting how Iraqis will read this book, because I think some people will be very mad. Like, how dare you say this is one consistent pattern because the monarchy was really amazing, or like Iraqi Jews were expelled, but they didn't experience sexual violence. And I'm like, do you exactly hear that? So like how all these like things are connected and then they get worse and worse with time. And so that's kind of the hunting for me, is trying to show that these stories are connected, really deeply connected, and they speak to each other, especially because the laws build upon each other. Like I try to show these connections through the laws. And the hunting is about that.
So I do have a few more questions, but I'm also aware that we have a room full of folks here and also folks on who may also have some questions. So maybe now we'll turn it over to see if there's any questions, whether online or here in person, what folks may have. And can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, my name is Jordan. I'm an undergraduate student here. I wanted to ask, in your research, have you ever interacted with young Iraqis that still live in Iraq? And have you noticed if they're curious about the people who've left, or if they even know about these expulsions? And I also wanted to ask, with the older generations in Iraq, do they have any of the same nostalgia that you encountered in communities in London and around the world?
Thank you so much. Actually, I'm very glad you asked these questions, because I was going to talk about that and then I forgot. So actually, it's interesting when you meet Iraqis. I haven't been back to Iraq, so I really don't know what Iraqis in Iraq, like I read about that, but I can't speak about it. When the Iraqis I met in London who left Iraq after 2003 had no nostalgia. So people who were my age at that time. And because like we lived only under wars and sanctions. So there was, and like we knew about like, okay, the amazing past that Iraq had. But for us, it was so abstract. So it was really interesting for people who lived in Iraq throughout the 80s, 90s, and left after 2003. There isn't this like really painful nostalgia that you encounter among older Iraqis or young Iraqis who left when they were really young. They can't remember anything about Iraq, but they just like have internalized their parents' romantic memories. So like it was even interesting. Once I interviewed an Iraqi man who was 26 at the time, and he told me, I'm an Iraqi, but I'm not an Iraqi of this time. I'm an Iraqi of the 40s and 50s. When actually his grandparents had lived, not even his parents. But like for Iraqis who lived under Saddam Hussein, you don't see that nostalgia. You see like, oh, thank God we are not there. Like so that's really an interesting thing. But also I think part of like talking about like older generation and this nostalgia, like I've encountered it among Iraqis, like in different places, whether like the United States, Lebanon, or the UK. Even sometimes if I run into somebody who is from Europe. And of course, part of the like one of the things that makes Iraqis so nostalgic for Iraq is kind of the class issue. So a great number of Iraqis who were expelled or like had to flee Iraq experienced downward social mobility, because like their degrees, their careers were never recognized that or acknowledged where they went. So they had to take like really like menial jobs. So to them, like the loss of status entailed the loss of race as well. And one of the interesting things that I noticed in London is like I always conducted interviews in cafes. People never, like rarely, like unless they are upper middle class Iraqis or middle class Iraqis who left in the late 70s and who had studied in Britain before. And they invited me to their houses. But Iraqis who were refugees and had to live on aid from the government and lived in council houses, they would never. I've never been to any of their houses, and I interviewed 120 people in London. So I think part of the nostalgia is the nostalgia for like people had a position, they had a decent living standards, the children seem to be having a good future. So all of these things, I think like the class issue also plays a huge role in this nostalgia. It's like the emotional attachment is not just because like it's some abstract, it's really related to lived realities that the majority of Iraqis who left were really middle class or like lower middle class who were like starting to have social mobility, and all of that came to an end. And then when they went abroad, because of racism and discrimination, they never been able to make it. So then that also makes the nostalgia for Iraq more evident, and like it would make sense actually.
All right, this question comes from Glenn in the online audience. Glenn asks, you've mentioned denaturalizations based on ethnicity, religion, and political activity, but were there ever any waves of denaturalizations on the basis of gender or sexual identity?
With the Iraq, the short answer is no. But with Iraqis of Iranian origin, what happened was that young women were subjected to sexual violence during their the expulsion process, because they were put in deportation camps, and then they were sent to the borders with Iran. And then there was the case of young men between the age of 18 and 28. They were all detained. They were never expelled with their family, and they disappeared. So far, there has never been an issue about expulsion because of gender or sexual identity. And having opened this topic, actually in Iraq, in 2001, Saddam Hussein issued a law about criminalization of homosexuality. But then in Iraq, a year ago, there was the first very strict law that criminalizes homosexuality, queer identities. So that's kind of something new. But this is why it hasn't been used so far. Mostly queer people in Iraq, especially after 2003, have been killed by militias. But denaturalization hasn't been used as a tool to deport people with non-conforming gender and sexual identities.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions, but I really just want to throw this thought out here. So I'm very interested in David Scott, the Caribbean theorist's work about history and memory. And when you were describing how Iraqis connect with the state despite the problems that they recognize with the state, I was thinking about his discussion of post-colonial history in general. He's talking about C.L.R. James, but he's kind of talking more broadly. And he's saying that when people, how do we assess writing in the past that is based on imagining a future that we know never happened? And so when you read C.L.R. James and he's like, colonialism is going to end, it's going to be awesome. And he says it much more smartly than that, but that's the basic point. And you reading him, you know that colonialism ended and some bad things happened and some good things happened, but it didn't turn out to be the world that people imagined. And so I feel like that you are talking to people who have struggled with that question, but their answer is to ignore that it didn't happen. Yeah. That they are engaged with reading their own past and the future that they imagined, and then kind of skipping over the fact that future didn't happen. Yeah.
So actually, it's the disenchantment you feel among older Iraqis in the UK is really heartbreaking. It's so hard to watch because when you talk to Iraqi communists, and Iraq in the for the audience who doesn't know much about Iraq, like Iraq in the like until the 60s, 70s was an extremely secular country. All the political movements were like secular, either Arab nationalist or communist. Like really the religious opposition movement didn't start until the late 70s. So when you talk to Iraqis like who were communists in the 40s and 50s, and who really believed in what like David Scott's talk about, like you think about like the past is backward, the present is unruly and colonial, and the future will be utopian. So the time will unfold in this kind of progressive linear way where you attain utopia. And they really believed in that. So when you listen to them and to hear like the disenchantment and the heartbreak, it's really, really sad. Like I sometimes, like I even once, like when I was talking to young Iraqis who left after 2003, just to go back to the first question, we sometimes think of ourselves as being a little bit luckier because we don't have any really nostalgic view or yearnings. Like we've lived through Iraq, we knew what it is. But for the older generation, it's really the inability to make sense of how things turned is really heartbreaking. So like for me, like Iraqis right now are really stuck, like it's an impasse, which is like everywhere, like the conditions of precarity, like zones of abandonment. This is like Iraq just another case. So yeah, so they just can't get their head around. And interestingly, sometimes the explanations they use are really like horrific because then it becomes like reproducing Orientalist discourses about Iraq. Because most of this generation studied in Iraq and we had a British education system, curriculum. So it's all like, oh, Iraq is what it is now because the countryside came over. Like the people from the countryside, the savages, the uncivilized people took over, and this is why things began to go downhill. Or like after 2003, it's like, oh, religious people came and took over, and that's why. The inability to see like really how imperial powers shaped like the history of Iraq or the present and the future of Iraq. And like the geopolitical like concerns like impact like how a country, kind of the trajectory of a country. It's amazing like for people who are communists that they are unable to see that. And they are just stuck that the utopian future did not happen, and there is a huge heartache and heartbreak over it, but an inability to see why that happened or what's the alternative. So the alternative is for the people from the countryside and the religious people not to take any role because they don't know how to rule. And that's like the thing, like it's really amazing when you hear them talk about that, and then you realize they are all like from Baghdad, middle class, upper middle class. And so then even the communists, they are unaware of their class hierarchies. So I hope they don't see this interview because this event, because they will be very unhappy with me. So that's the inability. Like this is like, and then again, like everybody is our pain is our own, and it's unprecedented, and you other people didn't suffer. So all of these things like really make the post-colonial future like it was just a fantasy that wasn't going to happen for whatever reason. Yeah.
I have two. That's okay. So the first one's from Emily, and that is, have you come across any experiences of Iraqis who were denaturalized or their descendants who have tried to move back and or become Iraqi citizens again?
Yeah, actually, after
You want to just repeat the question in case people didn't hear?
So the question is if anybody from Iraq, any Iraqi who's been deported, have been back to Iraq, living there, right? Yeah. So it's interesting, the 2006 Iraqi nationality law, that's the latest Iraqi nationality law. It gave people who were stripped of their citizenship, it gave the people who were stripped of their citizenship and their children the right to reclaim their Iraqi citizenship, except for people who were denaturalized in 1950 to 51. So even the word Iraqi Jews were not used. It was the word that was used like that actually the law was used to signify people. So the Iraqis of Iranian origin I met in London talked about that. They knew people who went back, especially from Iran, who went back to Iraq after 2003. But again, here it was never a seamless process, because if you were part of the ruling elites after 2003, then you would be able to get your citizenship and your property much easier than if you were not part of the ruling elites. And actually, if you came from abroad, like the UK, trying to reclaim your citizenship or like ask for confiscated properties of your parents, you had to pay a lot of bribes. People were really humiliated. So it actually like added insult to injury. The fact that if you were an ordinary Iraqi, not affiliated with the government, and tried to go back, it was like more like an experience that affirming that they don't belong. While if you were part of the Iraqi ruling elites, people went back, but the people who went back and lived there again, they were part of the ruling elites. So I don't know about the number of how many Iraqis of Iranian origin who were in Iran managed to relocate, because at one point in the early 2000s, some people went back, but then when the civil war happened, people went back to Iran because Iran turned out to be better than Iraq. So then again, and that's like, again, there are no enough studies about these issues. And I'm hoping the book will lead to further research about all these communities who are spread all over the world, and kind of how they managed, what their aspirations, what are their hopes for return. So this is something an open question for me, actually.
Mentioned there was
Yes,
another
yeah, I do have a second one. This one's from Orlando, and that is, has there been any distinction in Iraq between the deprivation of naturalized citizenship versus the deprivation of birthright citizenship? Are similar terms and processes used to describe both, or is there not any distinction made?
So in Iraq, actually, we don't have birthright citizenship. So you inherit, and that's like actually how historically Iraqis of Iranian origin have been dispossessed, because when you have an Iraqi, like a citizen, like an Iranian citizenship under the Ottoman, you have a letter again, next to the number of your ID that shows if your ancestors were Ottomans or Persians. So people inherit that category. So citizenship in Iraq, like right now, it is like an Iraqi is somebody whose either parent is an Iraqi, but originally it's never been a birthright citizen. So it's been mainly that people who were Ottoman subject and resident in Iraq as of X, Y, and Z, or people who had to have their fathers and grandparents born in Iraq. So that's kind of where it is. So it's, and like an interesting thing about the Iraqi nationality law, it's a combination of really Ottoman law, of like the Lausanne Treaty that came into being with the establishment of the League of Nations, and then it was modified at different times depending on the political atmosphere. So it's really it was never like one continuous law that existed. It's like it had different shifts and turns, and historically it is tied to Ottoman rule and the fear of Shia versus Sunnis and Shia becoming a majority. And that kind of, if you read the book, you will get to that, how that happened actually.
questions on it.
That's it for now.
Any questions here? Maybe I'll take this opportunity to loop back to something that was raised to a degree in one of the first questions from our colleagues online, and that you then addressed and spoke a bit more, and maybe we can expand it slightly more, is that another important intervention of your work is your discussion of the gender difference of how, in particular, the Tabaiyya, men and women, experience being denaturalized and expelled, and how this is also connected to different forms of gendered violence. So maybe I'll invite you to say a bit more about that, because I don't think the audience will be aware of your argument. And then I have a few follow-up questions really quick.
Great, thank you so much. So actually, one of the reasons that I was a little bit not sure how this book will go is because I couldn't find any Iraqi woman who was deported accept, like agreeing to talk about sexual violence. So one of the things when Iraqis of Iranian origin were deported in the early 80s, we always heard stories of sexual violence against women and that young men disappeared. And the issue about young men is that there was always rumors that they were sent to the borders during the Iran-Iraq war as fodder for the war, or they were killed, or they were guinea pigs for chemical experimentation. So, and then all of, like, everybody who was detained, nobody was found alive after 2003. And some of these young men were disappeared in 1980. So like their families lived with these unanswered questions until now. Like if they were lucky, they would find something, like they would have found something in mass graves. So these are two stories of like gender-based violence that are completely different, because one story about like when it comes to sexual violence against women, there is really a lot of silence, and there is always people talk about it in general terms. Like Saddam Hussein's regime was so horrible and they tried to inflict as much pain as possible upon humanities, and even didn't like they even used sexual violence in order to to taint the family's honor. So that's the language people use, but nobody. And then the rhetoric I always heard is that we heard about these stories, we know people. Luckily, our women didn't go through that. So there was always this avowal that sexual violence is out there, it's not here, and we don't know anyone, and we can't introduce you to anyone, even if we do know people, because they don't want to talk about it. So there was really, and that's what I'm like, how am I going to write a book about citizenship and I can't write about gender because there is silence? And then when you meet people like Iraqis of Iranian origin who had family members, like young men disappeared, they show you their pictures, their names, what they were doing in the university, or what they hope to do when they go to university. So the experience of young men who disappeared was real, and I could see who they are, and the experiences of women were completely erased. And so that's one of the things I try to talk about as well, how like the gender-based violence was kind of talked about very differently by the community. So like there is silence regarding women, but like celebration of martyrs, like the young men that were described as martyrs. So there is that aspect of the gender violence, but then the other aspect of gender-based violence is that for a lot of Iraqis, like even the experience of Iraqi Jews or like individual Iraqis who got deported, like Assyrians, communists, or Shia scholars, was that, oh my God, look how the monarchy was great, because none of these people experienced sexual violence. So that's like how rewriting history and how the monarchy got kind of even more romanticized, that they were ethics at the time. Nobody touched the woman. And like the fact that a whole community was uprooted was kind of cast into this positive light, like they were not punished, and like the young men didn't disappear. While under Saddam Hussein, it was unprecedented, and it was unprecedented. So, and like then gender violence became an integral part of denaturalization. So that's again like the whole thing about gender-based violence, and I talk about that in chapter 5, how that experience like is talked about differently, and there is such a taboo to talk about violence, sexual violence against women. It's really tragic, because these women remain like really faceless and voiceless. And if I didn't grow up in Iraq and hear about these rumors, maybe I wouldn't have known about it. Yeah.
Any other questions based on that? I had two further questions. So one is following up on the question of gendered violence, and then the other one is thinking about citizenship, the conferral of citizenship rights, as you mentioned, is the term used, how it's passed on.
Yeah.
As a sort of two streams. So one, with respect to gendered violence, in works that look at questions of, sorry to bring up a jargonistic word in this context of interdisciplinary scholars, but in the context of like biopolitics, necropolitics, there's a number of scholars who've emphasized sexuality, gender relations, and race to these processes, right? So an example is Foucault in the later writings of the history of sexuality, talks about the importance of who has sex with who as being connected to the perpetuation, the consolidation of certain populations and populations he later discusses in terms of processes of racialization. And we've got Anne Stoller's work and we've got Maya McDashie's work that's pointing to then the question of sort of the continuity of populations, just let's say questions of sexuality. And so I was wondering how this work and your discussion of gendered violence may help us to, I don't know, think about these processes in a complementary, in a different way, where it's perhaps, I don't know if this is the necropolitics part of it, but in the killing of, the young men, that makes makes any kind of hopeful future of the possibility of continuity of citizenship impossible by virtue of their death. Right? So the kind of necropolitics dimension of it. But then if we think about the gendered violence that women experience, does this help us to understand a different dimension of this violence? Or do you see your work speaking to this scholarship, looking at these questions?
Yeah.
I hope my
No, thank you. That's actually a very good question because also I'll mention something about the laws in 1980. So what's interesting really about kind of gender-based violence and the question of gender and citizenship, and especially women's citizenship, that actually, like in 1980, some of the laws tied back to the Ottoman laws. So under the Ottoman laws, like under Ottoman rule, because in the second half of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was trying to have reforms, and one of the things they did is introduce the idea of citizenship. And under the Ottomans, there were so many edicts and decrees about Sunni men cannot marry Shia women, or if a Sunni woman marries a Shia man, the children will be considered to be Sunnis and they will be recruited to the Ottoman army. So there was definitely this fear is that the women then become a threat to the nation, like they are the internal enemy, the foreign woman who would the Shia Iranian woman will marry the Sunni Ottoman man and have Shia kids and dilute. So there is that fear. And it was really interesting that the Ottoman Empire was trying to introduce a universal citizenship law, and then the exceptions they made is related to Sunni Shia marriages. They were very anxious about Sunni Shia marriages. And they actually had laws banning them, and they say if a judge, a religious scholar, or a judge marry people from different sects, they will be punished. So that's so absolutely something was going on. In Iraq in 1980, so with gender-based violence, the other incident I didn't actually mention is that 2 months or a few months after the denaturalization decree was issued, there was another decree that gave Iraqi men who are married to Iraqi women of Iranian origin the right to divorce their husbands, to divorce their wives, and to give them 4,000 dinar, which at the time was $12,000 in 1980. If they were in the military, and if they were civilians, they would get 2,500 dinars, which is around $7,000. So that was a lot of money at that time. So again, because these women began to be seen as the internal enemy that is in the family and in society that is going to undermine the state. And unfortunately, again, this is one of the issues. I could never find any woman who was divorced by the husband who would be willing to talk to me. The one case I found, which was really interesting, was a Sunni woman who was married to a Shia Kurdish guy who was expelled, but she like somebody told her to stay and like not to go to the borders because of sexual violence. And then after she returned to Baghdad, like Ba'ath officials came to her and they were like, we can divorce you from your husband and we will marry you to one of our Ba'athist hero. So then suddenly now the state is acting as the patriarch who can dissolve these marriages because like it should be the husband who can dissolve the marriage in Iraq. The woman didn't like unless it's specified women. It's hard for women to ask for the right for divorce. So it was really interesting in this case that the state became the arbiter or the father who can dissolve marriages. So definitely, like the whole like the work of Maya Mikdashi and like the right to uproot, the right to kill, that or necropolitics, is definitely part of it. Because like in the case of young men, like definitely like the right to kill was exercised by the government, but also the right to intervene in marriage relationships and family relationships, that kind of became the prerogative of the state as well by issuing laws, giving husbands like actually giving them incentives to divorce their taba'iyya woman, and then telling a woman who is married to a taba'iyya man that we actually can dissolve the marriage, which is like for people this will never be invalid because the husband needs to be there and it needs to be done legally for the marriage to be dissolved. So that's where it's really quite fascinating what happens in Iraq in this regard.
And I'm really glad you talked about the Ottoman precedent here because I was really struck by this instance because in other situations where we think about the passing along of categories of citizenship or the possibility of citizenship, not always, but typically the patrilineage is deemed determinative.
Mm-hmm.
And in this context, that was not the case.
No.
And I was wondering what was at play here. So I don't know if you've written more about that, but I think, or if that, unless I missed it in the book, but I think that would be a really wonderful area to explore further. Just in terms of how imaginaries of gender, sexuality, marriage relations, as you termed it, are connected to the possibility of citizenship and its activity. There is something quite particular in the situation that I think speaks to in relation, but also complicates some of the other stories that are told about the importance of sexuality and citizenship. So,
yeah, like I mentioned, like I think because like the last chapter was the final chapter I wrote, and then when it hit me, actually, like it's okay not to have women who want to talk to me. I can talk about silences, and I can actually analyze the rhetoric people that have been using to like in order not to introduce me to women or to allude to things. But it's an area that I'm very much interested in because like it also sometimes like especially like it's sometimes popular culture in the Arab world is like all the women are conniving. It's again the whole like patriarchal, like you cannot trust the women, they are conniving and they are marrying, especially like if they are foreigners, Iranians or something, they would marry our men in order and then turn them against the government. So suddenly like women become like spies or something, and they like actually they are the threat because they are in the family. So it is like in the future, like definitely I would love to explore this more, and I discuss it like to a certain extent in chapter 5, but not fully.
yeah, and this awkward, somewhat pained expression, I don't know if you folks probably couldn't see it, but I think Zainab Saleh is me thinking about some of the pop songs that have come out of the Khalij talking about Khaliji men, like women from outside.
Exactly.
Kind of suspicion. So,
Exactly, that is suspicion. So, but like it's really interesting here. These women were all Iraqis, but the government dubbed them as foreigners and hence as a threat to national security and to the family. So they should be denaturalized or divorced. Yeah.
And then just to go back to the categories of citizenship of Ottoman or Persian, how does that carry through? Is that passed along to the father or the mother? How is that?
So it's really interesting, this whole issue about like the citizenship of Ottoman versus Persian nationals in Iraq, because like it was like citizenship for a long, like still is something that people think about it in pragmatic terms. So for Iraqis or like the inhabitants of Ottoman Iraq who chose the Persian citizenship, it was just really a pragmatic. It's like to them, Persia and the Ottoman Empire are like empires who are ruling us. So how can we really preserve ourselves? So that's why like people chose like the Persian citizenship, as I said, just to avoid serving in the Ottoman military and paying taxes. And then when the first Iraqi nationality law granted Iraqis who held Persian citizenship under the Ottoman the right to citizenship as long as they are and their fathers are born in Iraq. And then, but in Iraq, we have two types of Iraqi citizenship. Now they did away with it, like within the last 5 years, now we have one ID. But before we had an ID and then we had certificate of nationality. And the certificate of nationality is really a very dangerous document because that document has like the number of your citizenship, and then the letter again next to it shows what your ancestor held. And because this number is inherited, so you can be born in Iraq, you could have been living in Iraq for 500 years, but then your grandfather who got the Iraqi citizenship had the letter B, which means he held Persian citizenship, then you inherit it.
How is it inherited?
Because the citizenship is passed through the father.
It's through the father.
It's through the father. So whatever the father's letter that gets put on your citizenship.
Okay.
And that was really like, it never like, that's kind of the unintended consequences sometimes. Like this never became an issue until the Ba'ath Party took over in 1968. And this is when you began to see like in even states in job announcements that certain jobs are open to Iraqis whose ancestor held the Ottoman citizenship. It's like it's formal. It's like it's legal there. So then that means like all people whose ancestor held the Persian citizenship are excluded. And so that kind of letter that I don't know why, because I couldn't find any archival material about that. Like, why did you have this kind of two categories of citizenship and why you institutionalize it? Because it was never used under the monarchy or under the British, but it was reinterpreted under Saddam Hussein's regime. And then having a Persian national citizenship came to indicate foreignness, but also loyalty to Iran and inherent hatred of Arabs. So that's when it became extremely kind of dangerous and began to encompass so many issues. So yeah.
Great. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but before we let you go and we let everyone else go, one last question. And it is an issue that you raised earlier, right? That this book, speaking as it does to questions of citizenship and expulsion, really hits on a very acute and increasingly painful issue that we're grappling with here in the US. So I wanted to invite you to reflect on perhaps how the book may help us to grapple with this, not necessarily, although one might hope for some hope, but perhaps not in a hopeful way, but perhaps also in a cautionary tale way.
Yeah, so actually when you look like at I opened the introduction with all these like recent and contemporary instances of denaturalization, whether like in Bahrain, in Israel, in El Salvador, in the UK, with this famous case of this young woman who joined ISIS. So it just like when you read about the news of about people who are opponent of the regimes and they are accused of being foreigners and disloyal to this, like it's really amazing. Like whether it's the Bahraini government, the Israeli government, the British government, they all say these people who losing their citizenship represent a threat to national security. And actually, when you even look at the constitutions of different countries, even now in the United States, in the Constitution, there are 7 criteria why native-born citizens might lose their citizenship. And that's when things become very dangerous. because like if you like it's like if you served in a foreign army, if you voted in a foreign election, or if you represent a threat to national security. So I don't know if I have any, like my cautionary tale is that people look at citizenship laws very seriously, because like in the constitutions, all of like whether countries are democratic or authoritarian, first world, second world, third world, what have you, in all constitutions, there is always a clause that if somebody is a threat to national security or disloyal to the state, then they can lose their citizenship. And yet it's the state and the elites who can determine what represents national security. So it's like kind of a catch-22, because the state can tells you we are going to strip you of your citizenship, but also the state is the one who can determine what action constitutes like offenses that require such a method. Yeah.
And I think your comments earlier about, latent possibilities that then get active.
Exactly. That's the whole thing, the unintended consequences.
So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the online audience as well. Thank you.